A little over 800 years ago, in 1215, King John of England signed a document with his rebellious barons that created a principle that has been iconic through the centuries since that time. In fact, this document, known as the Magna Carta, had tremendous influence on our own United States Constitution. What was the principle that became so groundbreaking? It was this: the king is not above the law. According to a recent Associated Press report, Democratic leaders in the House of Representatives are pressing the president to, quote, issue executive orders that could push their proposals forward without votes in the House and the Senate. In other words, they're asking the President of the United States to bypass the Congress and impose the stalled agenda of the left by executive fiat. Even House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who you would think would be protective of the prerogatives of the House of Representatives, she has said it's very important for the executive to act if we cannot get legislative action immediately. Then she uses an egregious analogy. She says even Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order. Well, if she had any historical understanding at all, she would know that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was in fact an executive order, but it was under the guise of his War Powers Act as a president. In other words, an executive order is simply an order from the executive branch of the government that furthers some issue that is already within the power of the president to do so. And under the War Powers Act, Lincoln had the authority to make that order. He didn't issue the Emancipation Proclamation simply because his party couldn't pass their pet bills. What's happened here is we live in a generation where the Democratic Party has attempted to fundamentally transform our republic in ways that voters don't support and in ways that would do real violence to the Constitution. Vice Chair of the Democratic Caucus, Pete Aguilar of California, says this, and he's very magnanimous when he says this. This is a quote: "Legislating is always our preferred strategy. We know that there's no substitute to developing laws that deliver benefits to our communities." He goes on to make his case that because we can't get these through, and of course it's the Republicans' fault, he says we need to be protected by the president doing his part to put these policies in place without congressional approval. Apparently, Representative Aguilar is unaware of what we call the separation of powers doctrine. If he wants a law passed, it's not just his personal preference that we do it by taking it through Congress. The Constitution is plain. All legislative powers are granted and vested in Congress, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. The president does not possess the power to issue imperial decrees from on high. Now, he can operate within the powers that are already granted to him, but that's not what's being asked here. A president cannot issue executive orders that infringe on powers granted to other branches of government. In fact, polls show that that is not favored by an overwhelming majority of Americans. And yet, because the left is frustrated that we haven't bought into Build Back Better and the Green New Deal, somehow we need to have a dictatorial announcement from on high that we will all live by. Well, I'm going to explain biblically what our response needs to be, but let me show you how this also plays out. It's not only our government that is overreaching and asserting an authority that does not belong to them, but we now see, emboldened by our government, other areas of influence in our country are also acting in a way that denies that they have any accountability or responsibility for what they do. For example, in the Eau Claire School District in central Wisconsin, we have a teachers' conference that suggested that teachers allow children to function under names related to a preferred gender identity without the obligation to share that information with parents. In fact, according to one of the trainers in this conference that the teachers went through, he says parents who disagree with their kids about gender identity issues are guilty of abuse. Now it's interesting, the teachers at this school are being instructed to hide their students' changing gender identities from parents on the grounds that, and this is a quotation, that parents are not entitled to know and that it is knowledge that must be earned. In other words, what this new policy in Wisconsin is saying is really three dangerous messages. First, that schools and not parents are in control of children. Secondly, that district leaders are okay with pitting teachers against parents. And thirdly, that what goes on inside of Eau Claire school classrooms is privileged information, and unless parents are progressive enough, they haven't earned the right to know what their children are being taught. This is where we're headed. Not only is the government becoming dictatorial in their approach to laws and positions that the public themselves won't support, but now we have an elite class making their way through all levels of academia, doing what they say is best, even when we don't accept it. How do we respond to this biblically? Well, first of all, let's just start with the family issue, and then we'll look at the government issue. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, it says, "Hear, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall repeat them diligently to your sons, and speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk on the road, when you lie down, and when you get up." In other words, from the very early pages of the Bible, it's very clear that the biblical view of government starts with a biblical view of the family. Government is not in the place of God to decide what is right or wrong. Families stand accountable to God for raising the children that have been entrusted to them. And as families are strong and as they teach what is true, that should have a ripple effect throughout the levels of governing authorities. Now, anytime you talk about something that the government wants to do, you'll always have somebody go, well, what about Romans 13? Well, let's see what Romans 13 says. This is sort of the crux of the Christian attitude toward government in a theoretical way. I mean, this is the basic philosophical approach to government, and it sounds pretty cut and dried. Paul writes in Romans chapter 13, "Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a servant of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for the sake of conscience." Now, what Paul tells us here is that government is ordained by God and that it is our role to be in submission to the authority that God has established. Now, Romans chapter 13 is very straightforward, and it's a powerful philosophy of government. But I want you to understand two things about this passage that progressives and liberals will fail to point out. The first part is that Paul is very clear that government is a delegated authority that comes from God. It is not an absolute authority. So when Paul says everyone should be in subjection or in submission to the government authorities that are over you, he is not suggesting that government has free rein to tell us to do anything and we're just bound by the laws of citizenship to do that. The Bible does not teach that we disobey every single unjust law that we bump up against, but it does tell us over and over again that we are to disobey the government when the government compels us to sin. You want some biblical examples? The Hebrew midwives in Exodus chapter 1, verse 17, they disobeyed Pharaoh's wicked command to kill all the Israelite boys that were born. Queen Esther broke Persian law by approaching the king to plead for the Jews in Esther chapter 4, verse 16. Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, disobeyed Nebuchadnezzar when he demanded that they worship him. Daniel later disobeyed another king when he was commanded to stop praying to the one true God. In the New Testament, Peter and John are arrested more than once for disobeying Jewish authorities when they told them to stop preaching Jesus. The point is that God's authority is greater than that which is granted to a government. So while we are to obey the government, we are also to obey God, and when those two loyalties come into conflict, our loyalty to God carries the day. I love people who try and make the case that the American War of Independence was really an illegal action because they broke biblical principles by rebelling against the king. The fact of the matter is that's not historically accurate at all. The colonists were subjects of the British king, and he had a requirement, partly by the Magna Carta and the hundreds of years of argument up to that point, that the king must abide by the law. The king was obligated to protect the colonists. When they were taxed without representation, the king forfeited his right for their loyalty because he didn't do his job. It's unfortunate that we call it the American Revolutionary War because it wasn't a revolution. It was a legal secession because the governing authorities had failed to keep their part of the contract between government and citizen. In our day, what that means is if the federal government oversteps its bounds and violates the Constitution, the states are set up in our structure to defend the people. It's the idea that we have levels of government so that no one part of the government can ever become tyrannical. A governor, we criticize governors nowadays when they don't do what the president wants, but our system is actually set up so that the governor can protect his people in his state from an overreaching federal government. It's what John Calvin called the doctrine of lesser magistrates. That is, a prince has a duty to the people under him to protect them if the king fails to keep his part of the contract. A state official, like a governor in our system, has an obligation to protect his people from a tyrannical federal official. In fact, in constitutional terms, it's called nullification, and it's when a state refuses to accept a law imposed by the federal government. Listen, civil government has a legitimate role in society, but this is the second thing. Not only is that authority delegated from God and not absolute, but the second thing that this passage tells us is that government's role is limited. That is, it's specifically to be used to restrain evil in a society. God instituted civil government to hold evil at bay, not to usurp the roles that other institutions in the culture should play, like the church and the family. There are two views of the Bible, of this issue in the Bible. One is called the protectionist view, and one is called the perfectionist view. The protectionist view says that civil government is to protect people's basic rights, life, liberty, property. Those rights are interfered with by crime and other issues of illegal behavior. The government is designed to protect the average citizen and allow them to live their lives by fighting against those intrusions into normal life. The perfectionist view of government raises government to a level of God and says the government is charged to solve all the problems in a culture. Paul goes on in Romans 13 to talk about taxes, but he ties taxes to maintaining this justice system. Political officials, governors, policemen, firemen, military, those people who fulfill the biblical obligation to protect its citizens so that they can live their lives. The philosophy of government in the Bible does not teach that it's the government's job to provide education and welfare and food stamps and Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security and 1,000 other government programs which we have accepted over the decades and now wake up to find out that we have ceded control of our lives to the government. The concept of government as an agent of redistribution of resources is simply foreign to Scripture. So what do we say here? We contact our federal representatives and tell them to not stand for an executive overreach by our president. We contact our state representatives and remind them of their biblical responsibility to defend the citizens of their state from an overreaching and increasingly tyrannical federal government. And we elect school boards that will shut down this idea that schools own our children and that parents haven't earned the right to know what they're being taught. Listen, the biblical philosophy of citizenship is one of active involvement. It is not a hands-off, sit back and just take what you get. It's active and involved, but it's based on Scripture, not on our political preference. Study these passages and find what God calls the family to do and to be, and what He calls citizens to do and to be, and let's put government back in its place. It may be time for a new Magna Carta, because the president is not above the law. This is Truth Currents.